Welcome to the Learning Cosmos podcast. I'm your host, André Hedlund, educational psychologist, author, geek, and nerd. This show brings you science and learning through conversations with stellar people from different fields. Put on your spacesuits and hold tight. Our voyage into the learner's universe begins now. Okay, everyone. So welcome to another episode of the Learning Cosmos podcast. And I have a very special guest today, Gianfranco Conti. So thank you so much for being a guest on this podcast. I know you are relaxing in Italy, so that makes it even more special.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. So Gianfranco, let's start with, I like to ask my guests this question because I think it's important. You obviously study a lot how languages are learned, what are some of the best strategies, most effective ways of teaching. So why is it important for people to understand the science behind language learning and acquisition? So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, to be honest, my journey started exactly during my teacher training because I trained in England as a teacher. You'd have to do a special course called PGCE, Postgraduate Certificate in Education, in order to qualify as a teacher. And I come from Italy, where I was taught in a very traditional kind of way, which of course worked for me because I was highly motivated, because I wouldn't just stop at the classroom, right? Because let's face it, the most important thing is what you do outside the classroom, what you learned in the classroom, or learning will never stick. And during my PGCE, I had a little bit of a culture shock because I was taught in a completely different way from the Italian way, because the way I was taught in England was very much go into the classroom, show some flashcards, do some role plays, and then ask them to write something down, and that's the end of the lesson. And it was the so-called communicative approach, but not really the communicative approach. It was highly adapted to the context, which is unruly kids who don't necessarily value language learning, and they play up for half the lesson before you manage to actually teach them something. That was the context, at least where I was trained. I'm sure there are better schools out there.
Yes.
So I had the Italian way, the English way. I knew that there were benefits from both. And I was itching after starting teaching for the truth, because as often, like it's a bit like a divorce, right?
Yes.
There's her truth, your truth. There must be something in between, the third truth. And I embarked on a master's degree at Reading University, where they had all these amazing people, like really famous people who wrote all the EFL books. At that time, Reading was like a hub for all these big EFL innovators. So I went there, and then I was completely mind blown, because it was like all this science and cognitive science, discourse analysis research, and intercultural communication research, and reading and listening and speaking, and all the material design, all backed by research. So it wasn't like the teacher was telling you that. It was like, these are the references. And they were so rigorous. I was actually quite shocked because I was quite young and I had no idea there was so much research in language learning, because everyone tells you, oh, no, you can teach that way it works. No, actually, there is a science. Yes, there are certain things which are still kind of questionable or still relative to the context, but there are some clear principles which we enshrined in a book, the language teacher toolkit, the latest book, which are completely steeped in research, and I don't think that can be questioned. And when you have those principles and your team that you work with, which are essential to your success as well, because when you're teaching with a department, within a department, you might get kids who are taught by Mr. Jones, by Mrs., and you want some consistency which is rooted in science. And you find then when you actually study the science you immediately see a disconnect between what a lot of teachers do, because traditionally we were taught to do, according to much research. Let's face it, we often teach the way we were taught, even when we don't think
Absolutely.
we do.
Yeah.
It's a subconscious process proven by a lot of research. There's a guy called Simon Borg that wrote extensively about this. So when you see, for instance, certain thing that we do in the classroom with listening, right, where is constantly putting the students on the spot by guessing most of the time and listening to things that are way too fast for them, giving them this lie that it doesn't matter if you don't understand every word, as far as you get the gist. As far as you get the gist, it's okay to pass an exam or maybe to survive and cope in England under duress or stress. But when you want to learn from a listening text, we know it needs to be 98% comprehensible input. There's no, for me, for instance, the classic example of something that changed my practice massively, which was that you need to give the students opportunity for speaking, of course, but before that, you need to give them plenty of input. And when I was trained as a TEFL teacher through the CELTA course, which is PPP, it can work with a group of highly motivated and fairly bright individuals. But if you have a class of 30, or as in Malaysia, 45 children learning.
Same thing here in Brazil. Same thing.
You can't expect every child to be able to cope. It's just way above their cognitive ability. And another thing that, for instance, was for me a game changer was understanding the processes underlying production and the receptive skills. Because when you read the research and you understand what happens in the brain, then you cannot teach the same way as before. Example, when we listen, we do a lot of things which start with recognition of sounds, segmentation of the speech stream, identification of vocabulary. Then we apply a knowledge of grammar. And that is gold, because if you want to teach learners how to listen, then that gives you a blueprint in order to understand what their problems are. So, for instance, a typical teaching. I don't want to be disparaging teachers, because I'm sure there's a lot of teachers who do it already. But the typical teacher that I observed over 30 years of teaching, when it comes to listening, even the best of teachers, they just play the audio track. The students answer the questions, and they just get a mark. And they get a mark out of 10 or 15 or whatever it is. And I've always thought to myself, it cannot end there, because what happens to the half of the classroom who didn't get 5 out of 5 or 6 out of 5, but got maybe 1, 2, or 3? After the third or fourth time, they will switch off. They'll say, I can't do listening, right?
Exactly.
And instead, what I learned from research on my master's was, well, the most important thing about teaching listening is not only prepare them for the listening prior to the listening, so giving them the opportunities to learn the vocabulary, get their head around maybe the potentially difficult sounds or word, or grammar. Not only the preparation, but what happens afterwards. In other words, put the transcript on, get them to listen to that transcript, try to identify what the obstacles were. So going back to what I told you earlier, was it that there are certain sounds that they couldn't understand? Was it that they couldn't segment and identify the words? Could it be that there was something about the accent of the person? Maybe it was a northern a northerner rather than a southerner in England, or an American rather than an Australian?
Yeah.
Was it the syntax that was complex? And then after that, as a doctor would do, now that you understood what the issue was, now let's stage some activities which tackle, for instance, sound recognition or tackle segmentation.
Wonderful.
Games like, for instance, Spot the Intruder for segmentation,
Yes.
or break the flow games where they need, you give them the sentences without breaks and they need to find the beginning and the ending of words. Or if it's English, it would be assimilation, the way the words merge. So get them to identify that. Or if it's something to do with word order, some sentence puzzles to get them to focus on word order. Things that if you're a tennis coach or football coach, you would do after a match. You know, you lose the match, okay, what happened?
Absolutely.
Whereas often the children finish an activity so important as listening empty-handed. Or think about speaking. Speaking, we know it's so not intuitive, because on a CELTA course, for instance, or TEFL certificate course, or any teacher training, you just, okay, you've done your listening, you've done your reading, you've done some work on vocabulary. Now get the students to do a role play and speak. Or it could be a survey, or it could be what we call an information gap activity, typical of PPP, right? You do your presentation, you do your practice, and then role plays. I never thought about something so simple, but actually giving the students 5 or 10 minutes to plan the activity in advance, whereby you brainstorm the vocabulary with your partner, you anticipate what kind of problems that could be. For instance, it's a perfect tense. I'm not sure about these perfect tenses that might occur in the text. Those 5-10 minutes, such a small thing to think about. But when you know about working memory, you know that working memory has a very limited capacity. So if a child, if you want to be inclusive, you might have 10, 15 kids in your class that actually need those 5-10 minutes to plan. And that is gold, because it lightens the cognitive load. It gives the children some confidence because they come to the task having rehearsed some of things. And very often I realized that how just giving those 5 or 10 minutes is absolutely a game changer for a lot of kids. But again, because teachers very often, we are gifted linguists ourselves, we don't put ourselves in the shoes of the students who do need it. And luckily, cognitive science is amazing for that, because once you understand how finite working memory is, and you understand how many different things the brain needs to do in 2 seconds, because when you understand how limited, when we listen and when we speak, we have 2 seconds per sentence available. In those 2 seconds, when we speak, we need to formulate the thoughts, the ideas that we want to convey. Then in about 200 milliseconds, we need to retrieve the words that we need. Then we have another 200, 400 milliseconds to apply the rules of grammar. And then we need to pronounce, articulate the sentence. That means, And again, because of science, I got to the conclusion that I was failing my students. Not all of them, of course, but the weaker ones. Because if you see 5 or 6 different processes from different parts of the brain. And then you understand why. And again, without science, I would have never got there, and I would have never become a better teacher. I'll give you one final example, which is key, which is vocabulary. Vocabulary is responsible 70 to 90% for success in listening and reading. That's a huge percentage, 70 to 90%.
Absolutely,
And I never understood really why is it that students would not necessarily succeed in listening when I was a younger teacher, because I thought I'm giving them loads of practice before
Yeah.
they listen with the words, except that it was mostly written practice or,
Yeah.
because mostly it's worksheets, mostly is even worse, it's online. In those days, online resources were mostly writing and reading, not a lot of
Yep.
listening. And then I was introduced on my MA TEFL on. I was introduced to the principle of transfer appropriate processing, which
Oh,
says basically that if you learn something, vocabulary, through the written medium, it will not be available to you orally when you
absolutely.
listen. When you think about it, it's actually quite an obvious thing
Yeah.
until you are told that and you realize that, hang on, most of my vocabulary learning was actually reading and writing, not speaking and listening. Because most teachers don't teach vocabulary through speaking or listening unless you teach kindergarten. They do because
That's
kids
true.
don't
Yeah.
write.
Yeah.
And then you find that I get a lot of consultancy proposals from schools because one month before the exam, the kids are struggling with
Yes.
listening.
Yeah.
And of course, yeah. And I ask them the same question all the time. Do you teach vocabulary orally? Orally as
Yeah.
in hourly, and orally meaning orally. And
Yes.
the answer is often yes, a little bit. But if 70% to 90% of the success is listening, depends on vocabulary recognition, not grammar,
Absolutely. Yeah.
then how you expect your kids. So these are 3, 4 examples. I can give you more,
Yeah.
where cognitive science for me was an absolute game changer. And after my master's, I decided to pursue to PhD because I still felt that even my master's being only 1 year and loads and loads of information, I felt I needed to know more. And
Wonderful. Yeah. And
it
if
was,
I'm
it was,
Yeah.
go
No,
ahead.
no. I mean, everything you're talking about, Gianfranco, is absolutely important to teachers here. And I was wondering because you mentioned cognitive science, and the whole first season of this podcast was really me talking to cognitive scientists, asking about their theories, the concepts that are important. And you mentioned the works of so many people like Alan Badley and the working memory model, John Sweller and cognitive overload and cognitive load theory. And I feel that that's not really part of second language acquisition. So if you're going to become an English teacher or a language teacher, and I don't know, maybe you enroll in a TEFL or TESOL course or a second language acquisition or linguistics or whatever, those fields don't communicate very well, apparently. And that's my impression. And maybe you can tell me a little bit about that. They don't really communicate very well with cognitive science, with, psychology, cognitive neuroscience. It feels like they're not looking at the evidence that is already available, has been available for decades. And that's why it's very interesting for me to talk to you, because you're bridging that gap, I think. You're bringing the cognitive science into second language acquisition, TESOL, TEFL, and all of those things. So,
It's extremely important. Mm.
right. So,
It's
so
very
you,
important.
very important. So,
And there
what is the
are,
importance? Tell us more about that. What should we know more about from cognitive science that can help language teachers and even language students when they're studying on their own? What is important about
yeah.
that? Yeah.
I think the most important thing is understanding um, how key working memory is to
Yeah.
language learning.
Yeah.
Working memory, if you see it at the sort of badly and et al. Kind of a way, as simply as a model. And sometimes, when I go to CPD and
Yeah.
especially generic CPDs, it's always about the model. And you're right. Very often that model is seen as almost like an abstract thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, its working memory is limited. Working memory does this. Retrieval practice does that. But very often, the background in applied linguistics, which luckily I got at Reading University and then at Oxford later, was key in, like you said, bridging the gap. Because, of course, the big difference between language learning and learning geography, history, maths, and science, where unfortunately a lot of the pundits in our world come from, and in Twitter is usually scientists or mathematicians, people who teach maths, science, biology, chemistry. But when it comes to languages, the big difference is that you're not just retrieving.
Yes.
You are retrieving, and then you need to converse with the person, or you need to interact with the source when you're listening.
Yeah.
And the key thing to understand is exactly how fleeting the nature of listening and speaking is, the limited amount of time that you have to bring all these different elements, vocabulary, sound, grammar,
yes,
and of course, attending to the other person when you're speaking, which is another source of stress,
definitely.
Especially if it's somebody coming from a completely different background, like talking to an Indian. We speak the same language, English, but Indian English and their body language is completely different. And when you have a chat, I used to have a lot of Indian students, and where I live in Malaysia, there's a lot of Indians. We speak exactly the same language, maybe a slightly different accent, but the cultural differences, or Pakistani, can be quite different. So there you go. Intercultural communication is thrown in the mix as well, on top of everything else. Whereas, let's face it, when it comes to just retrieving a fact, you're just retrieving a fact. And that makes in your own language as well.
So and if I may add, sorry, Gianfranco, but that's something very important you said. So it's different from learning geography or history. So when you retrieve a concept from your geography class and you know how to define it or to explain, it doesn't mean you know how to apply that in a sentence, in conversation, in another language. So those are just remembering what something means is not the same as knowing how to use it in a conversation, right?
Exactly. And the biggest mistake made by a lot of teachers, especially beginners, is number one, the excess focus on grammar.
Yeah.
Because grammar, again, it's only valuable, like you were kind of saying now, when you use it in context. So one thing is to know, yes, to form the perfect tense, if to read is read, 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 speak, spoke, spoken, eat, ate, eaten. I remember learning it all like that, right?
Yes.
And
just
that
like
is declarative knowledge.
Yes.
Yeah, I know what it is, but then try and say it on the phone in conversation with company that you need to buy something from or sell something to, or try and write it in an email very quickly at the airport, or try and say it at the train station with the background noise. So the whole idea of cognitive science as applied to language learning is that you need to make an extra effort. And the extra effort is, okay, this is cognitive science, fine. Now let's read the relevant literature, which there is plenty of, where they do apply. For instance, you mentioned Bjork to me, that you interviewed Robert Bjork. So you interviewed Bjork. Bjork talks about desirable difficulty.
Absolutely.
Now, what is a desirable difficulty in language learning? So in language learning, desirable difficulty is anything that makes the learning of a specific structure, set, vocabulary set, or whatever, makes it a little bit more challenging so that it becomes a bit it becomes more difficult for working memory, and that difficulty makes it stick. But how do we apply it to language learning? It's really funny because everyone's talking about desirable, difficult. Okay, how do you apply it to language learning? And reading Paul Nation, for instance, a good answer is think about fluency. Yeah, fluency. I want students to learn how to do a role play, and I got two students doing the role play. So How about you ask them to do it the first time in 4 minutes? The second time, they need to be challenged doing 3 minutes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The third time, they need to do it under 2 minutes. That's an example of a desirable difficulty. But when you actually go to CPDs or you read the books, or everyone will tell you, oh yeah, desirable difficulty is what you need to do in order to make things stick, because Robert Bjork says that.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's apply it to the classroom. Another example, delayed dictation. So
Yes.
that's another example of a desirable difficulty. You give a dictation, accept that the kids need to wait 1 or 2 minutes, or maybe just 30 seconds, depending on the level of ability, and they need to write it only when you say, okay,
yeah.
after 30 seconds, now write the sentence down. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or it could be a delayed copying. Write the sentence, look at the sentence, but you can only copy 30 seconds or 1 minute later, so that they need to make the effort to keep it in their heads.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of these amazing things you can get from position, from cognitive science, but then you need to, like I did, think, how does that apply to language learning? Working memory. Working memory, everyone will tell you, okay, it can only contain, you can only juggle simultaneously 4, maximum 5 items in a second language, yeah, simultaneously.
Yeah.
Okay, how does that apply to language learning? And a typical example, for instance, is when the students need to process a sentence. And in that case, you see that number, depending, it varies. Badly says one thing and Sweller will tell you another thing, but we know that the capacity is very limited in the second language. You can juggle maybe at a certain age, you might be able to juggle when you are about 10 or 11, maybe 2 or 3 items.
Yes.
When you are maybe 16 to 30 years old, in your prime, you can juggle maybe 5 or 6 simultaneously. But imagine you want to apply to language learning. Think about a child writing a sentence, and the sentence contains 3 or 4 grammar rules they're not sure about, and maybe 2 or 3 vocabulary they're not familiar with, or they're slightly familiar with. You can see that now the kids are going to experience cognitive
overload. So plus the spelling, right? The right spelling. So all of those things are filling up their working memory. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So what can you do to lighten the cognitive load?
Yeah.
Before writing that text or that sentence? What can you do?
Yes.
And when you think about that, then okay, why don't we do some sentence puzzle first, work on word order? Why don't we do a little dictation to work on spelling, to warm them up? And then when they will eventually, at the end of the lesson, be asked to write the sentence, you have been smartly offloaded. And the kids, so the problem nowadays on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, is a lot of people dishing out very smart little posters, flow charts with cognitive load and this and that. And teachers are confused because they are almost like a mantra, which is very, very rewarding often to disseminate, because you get lots of likes and things. Oh yeah, cognitive load. Oh yeah. In the end, a lot of teachers go from confusion to boredom, because I go to CPD to do my CPD, and the minute I mention cognitive load, I can see teachers going, "Oh my God, not again." But then they become interested again when you actually show them how practically cognitive science can actually be very useful in language acquisition. But doing always, creating that link, it's not an obvious thing for a lot of professionals in our field.
Yeah, and you know what, Gianfranco, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because cognitive load is one of the most important contributions, I'd say, from cognitive science. But people talk about it in a way that doesn't make sense, or they are overloading people's working memory with the
That's a good
concept,
word.
right?
That's a good word.
They're talking too much about it. But here's an example, and maybe you can use me as an example here for your explanation, because I am going to China in 1 month. And I've started learning Chinese by myself, Mandarin, because I'm documenting what I'm doing, because it's always good for us to go back, and remember what it was like to learn a language, because we are teaching languages. So we should remember that feeling. And you mentioned something very important. Vocabulary is essential, fundamental. So 70 to 90% of the success rate depends on vocabulary. And of course, Chinese has absolutely nothing to do with the languages that I speak, a completely different language. So I listen to podcasts and very basic dialogues, just a couple of sentences. People say that, okay, why don't you tell your students to get more familiar with podcasts? Why don't they listen to a lot of things? But if it's beyond their comprehension level, cognitive overload, right? You will not learn anything from that. You don't have the previous memory to be able to decode what's going on, right? So based on your experience, your expertise, the book that you have published, the toolkit, so what is it that we can do to improve our listening, to get better, to learn more vocabulary so that we can better understand the language?
Are you talking as an individual doing self-learning, or are you talking about being a teacher in the classroom?
Yeah, so I think now you can focus on an individual trying to learn by themselves.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, in my experience, you need to find what is not your learning style, because that's been debunked.
Yeah,
Not your learning
completely.
style.
Yes.
But you need to go for your learning preference. And that is absolutely key. Because one thing that it's an issue when you are on your own, it's the lack of connectedness. If you're not connected to other people, to learn a language on your own is not just a lonely endeavor, that is unnatural, because interaction is central to language acquisition. That is one principle from Ellis and Shintan in 2013 that I've always had at the back of on my mind. But when I saw it articulated on that paper, I thought, man, that's the problem with a lot of learning that doesn't happen when you're on your own. Because Duolingo, you're interacting with a machine, but you don't have the smile, you don't have the joke, you don't have the look full of gratitude or affection of the mother or the father or your mentor talking to you. There's a lot of socialness that is not happening.
And
So the key thing
ChatGPT
is
as
to
well,
find,
right? Just to like
yes,
artificial intelligence in general, people are using that to learn. I've used it to come up with some dialogues, but again, I don't have the human factor to help, right? Yeah.
the good thing about ChatGPT, and I noticed that with my daughter the other day when she said, "Oh, I
Yeah.
love ChatGPT, she's my friend," is that
Oh,
when ChatGPT gets to know you after much interaction, it can start giving you back what you like. For
huh.
instance,
Yeah.
to motivate myself, before I have to write a big presentation or whatever, I say to myself, I said to ChatGPT, remind me, why am I a legend, right? And
Yes. Love it.
ChatGPT knows that to motivate me, she needs to give me 5 or 6 things to inflate my ego, right? I know she's
Perfect.
lying.
That's a
She
good
knows
strategy.
exactly what I want. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's just to motivate myself when I don't want to do anything, reminding me of my successes, quote unquote. Yeah, and when it comes to language learning, you need to find something. I learned by myself. I tried to learn 13 languages. I only succeeded with 5, and I'm a language teacher, so
Yeah.
it's okay. I failed in 8. It's very important for me to remind
Yeah.
myself of that. Why? Because I was learning those languages in the only ways that were possible to me in those days. So the resources available were books. Whereas the way I like to learn is songs, is movies, is interacting with people. So you need to find something which is highly motivating, because Most people, after 2 or 3 months, they jack in learning a language. Yeah. All people who start with Duolingo at the beginning, they're all happy. Yeah, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. Lots of repetition. After a bit, they ditch it. And I can see potential in AI for that. In those programs, I forgot the name of that program, where you can actually interact with a person. You actually see the person
Oh,
talking to you
yes.
and they give you feedback. Yeah. I can see some potential in there, but even that is just a meme. It's not a real person. So the first thing, the most important thing to crack when you're learning a language is the sound. When you actually crack the sound, because especially when you're younger, especially if you're a kid, but even as an older person, the most important thing to understand is that the neural path, the oral pathway is the key one. And there's plenty of studies showing that when you attach sound to a written word, you are much more likely to commit the word to memory. In the case of Mandarin, you have the tones, which are a big issue,
Very
on top of
difficult.
the fact that, on top of the fact that you have symbols to learn. So
Yes.
the key thing to do for me has always been get very familiar with the sound
Yeah.
and being able to attach sound to not just spelling, but to the word boundaries, where word begin and word end,
Yeah.
and doing a lot of work, which is decoding work. So watching a video and, for instance, see the caption, not the translation, the caption
Caption.
in the target language. Um, Being able to listen to a song with the lyrics. So that for
Yeah.
me has always been the starting point. Once you break the little barrier, initial barrier, and you master pronunciation, decoding skills, the ability to read aloud, then you become more efficient in learning vocabulary. Because the
Absolutely.
most important thing is to be able to create a strong mental representation of the word in terms of sound,
Yes.
phonological representation. You need to have those words stable in your mind as you unequivocally and clearly pronounced as possible.
Yes.
The key starting point has to be chunks, short phrases of high use. And the good thing about ChatGPT and AI, that you can actually tell ChatGPT, I learned these 20 chunks. I want you to create 4 or 5 short texts, including those chunks. And
Perfect.
it will do it and then you can start out and you can ask ChatGPT to create comprehension questions on those. So that could be, for instance, a good way for me to use ChatGPT or any other AI. But the key
Absolutely.
thing is a lot of input,
Yeah.
getting a lot of input, but making sure that that input, like you said earlier, is never beyond that 90-95% threshold of incomprehensibility.
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of teachers go wrong because you have to give a lot of authentic input,
Yeah.
but if it's not understandable, it doesn't work.
Absolutely.
Learning a lot, whole nation, learning a lot of list of words only makes sense if you then have the resilience, the perseverance rather, to keep going back to them, because
Yeah.
that's the other thing. You need to keep revisiting things. Luckily, there are programs online, there are softwares like Memrise, for instance, that can help you with that. They send you an email reminding you that you have to go back to that set of words that you learned 3-4 weeks ago. But the key thing, and that's where all the people I know who learned languages succeeded, is both as language learners in the classroom or working individually, not only doing the work that I just said, but making sure that you find a way to use them.
Absolutely.
Because seeking opportunity for using that language is absolutely key. So to
Yeah.
recap, focus on vocabulary massively, making sure that you have at least 15, 20 some people say up to 40 encounters with those words.
Yeah.
Start with chunks. Don't waste too much time on grammar. The sentence builders that I keep going on about, where you have grids, basically, substitution tables, they used to be called in the old days.
Yeah.
I coined the term sentence builders. Is basically is a good way to start mastering micro topics. For instance, solving a problem, or making arrangements for the night out, or simply
introducing
buying things
yourself
from a
or
grocery,
ordering
introducing
something.
yourself.
Yeah, perfect.
Exactly.
And
Because what?
yeah,
Go
no,
ahead.
I mean, you mentioned something that is key, and I've been applying this because I know the science of learning, spaced repetition, like going back to things that you studied sometimes weeks ago, and then just trying to remember, retrieval practice, not going back
That's
to my
right.
notes or anything like that, but actually trying to pull that back from my long-term memory. And I feel like a lot of students and teachers, they don't use that very effectively because teachers ask students to take a lot of notes, and then they tell students to go back to their activities maybe once twice before an exam or something like that. But we forget things quite easily, right, Gianfranco? Like if I'm exposed to a lot of vocabulary today, I might not remember much, or maybe not even anything tomorrow, right? So I have to do
Normally,
some
you
retrieval.
forget
Yeah,
about
yeah,
60% after about 9 hours.
yeah,
So after normally, yeah. The key thing though about
yeah.
retrieval practice, and this is, a lot of people, including myself in the old days, I remember when I was learning Spanish with my colleague, we
Yeah.
were French specialists, but we were hired to teach Spanish, and we had 3 months to learn to upskill.
Yeah.
And so the big mistake is to, okay, so my friend Aurélien would test me and say, okay, house, casa,
Yeah.
tree, árbol, a street, calle. And actually, now that I know much better about this, I could say, okay, that wouldn't be a bad idea as a little warm up
Of
to
course.
recall
Yeah.
the words. But the real retrieval practice that I need 3 or 4 weeks after, or 2 weeks after the event, is, for instance, something like the 4-3-2 technique that I mentioned to you earlier.
Yeah.
So, say where your house is. Say there are trees between
Yeah.
around your house. Say that the street is. Say in 4 minutes, the whole little bullet points in 4 minutes. Then say it in 3 minutes. Then try to say it in 2 minutes. Or
Exactly.
yeah. So retrieval practice, I call it dynamic as opposed to static. Because again, like you said, in geography, it's okay to be able to do that sort of retrieval practice. But in languages, you need to be able to use it. And that's a big problem with
Very
in
good.
England at the moment. You find that a lot of teachers rely on Quizlet, which is
Yeah.
very much basically static retrieval practice.
And
But what you really
retrieving
want to do,
isolated words, right? So,
that's
so
right.
just to make it clearer for everyone, instead of thinking of isolated words and trying to retrieve them, you could actually form a phrase or sentence like "Hay un árbol en esta calle de mi casa," or something like that. So you can actually put
Yes,
that together instead of just
exactly.
remembering lists of words. Isolated words
Exactly.
doesn't work very well. Yeah.
You wouldn't believe it, Andre, but I can tell
Yeah.
you that uh, I don't want to be unfair, but I would say at least 50% of the schools that I visit every year, they test the kids bi-weekly, so twice a week,
Okay.
on a list of words. And
Yes.
that's the
Yeah.
vocabulary test.
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of kids switch off. But
Yeah.
also, there's another very important problem. That when you give, imagine you're teaching in a state school,
Yeah.
especially, because in independent school, parents pay, they're conscious, and the parents are paid, they might put a little bit more effort in their homework. But in England, state schools, there are massive differences. I don't know if it's the same in Brazil, between
It
kids who spend a
is.
lot of time doing the
Yeah.
homework and kids who don't. So when you start relying on learning vocabulary through these tests, what happens? That after 6 months, you have those who've been consistent and conscientious who are up here.
Yeah.
And the ones instead who are not conscientious, and you're creating a gap which keeps widening, widening, widening until after 3 years, you find that these tests have benefited only certain kids and only relatively, like you said, because they only remember lists of words. So you can see two big drawbacks of this practice of testing students this way. The number one, you create a big gap between the homework lovers and the ones who hate homework and don't do it. And the second one, that even the more able, they just have loads and loads of words in their heads, but they hardly get to use them unless they're really motivating and conscientious.
So true.
That's a big problem.
And now let's focus a little bit on the perspective of a teacher. So if you are a teacher and you are looking for better ways to make your students' learning more effective based on cognitive science, right? So what do you think are one or two things that teachers do that is wrong or not aligned with cognitive science, and how can we fix that?
Yeah, a big one, huge one. I'll tell you because I can see the little bulb lighting up on my CPD attendees heads.
Yes.
Is something called the redundancy effect, which is basically when a student does a typical reading or listening comprehension, right? They're normally asked, what is the name of the person? How many sisters, brothers, whatever she got? What is the name of the dog? What did she do yesterday? What happened to mommy's car? And what is the plan they have for tomorrow afternoon? Right? Nothing wrong with that, except that you're focusing working memory, you're focusing attention on meaning.
Yes.
So when you focus on meaning, unfortunately, your working memory is so limited that it processes only meaning. That is a big problem because if you're using texts to model language, language is not just about meaning. It's also about form,
yes,
spelling, sound, word order, endings of words, regular, irregular verbs, adjectives that go before the noun or after the noun, little issues with prefix or suffixes or whatever. So there are so, not to mention in English, spelling.
Yeah.
So when you think about all of these things, then you realize that this breakthrough cognitive science is massive for language learning. That means that when I give my students these beautiful texts, which I pack with perfect tenses, connectors, and all these beautiful things, actually, they won't even notice them because
True.
you are hijacking their attention. You're not directing their attention on what you want them to learn, which is the 10 perfect tenses. You're actually directing their attention on the meaning, which will not teach them how to speak or write. Yeah. So if you think in these terms, then you realize that there's a big slice of activities, a big chunk missing, which is deliberate activities, for instance, which focuses the student on spelling, verb endings, word order. That's one. Yeah. The other aspect, which is very important, is that when you focus students on meaning, the brain tend to focus, especially in listening when the time is very, very short, 2 seconds per sentence, we focus only on nouns, adjectives, adverbs, and verbs, because these 4 words carry meaning. So if you're asking questions about meaning, you tend to focus only on words that carry meaning, right?
Absolutely.
But the problem is that every text that we write or that we speak, we need 55% of that text. We need to know it. And you know what this 55% of that text that we need to know in order to write and speak is? Words which do not carry meaning. So, because if you focus on adjectives, verbs, adverbs, and noun, you're going to miss articles,
prepositions,
and every other determiner, prepositions, pronouns,
Yeah.
and all the other things that have nothing to do with meaning. So what happens? They, number one, you're not teaching them how to speak or write because they miss the grammar, the syntax, the spelling, and the sound. Number two, they're not going to learn the 55% of the words you
Yeah.
need, which put together those four word types. Yeah. So, what's the point of knowing adjectives, verb, if you don't have all the other words that you need to link them in? And these words happen to be the most frequent words in every language on the planet. I'll give you an example. The most frequent word in French is the article le in French.
Yes.
Yeah, but most kids that you meet in state schools, especially kids who are not that able, will not even know the difference between le, la, and les.
Les.
They just
Yeah.
slap them randomly. Why?
Yeah.
Because they've never been focused on those. That's one huge things that made
So true.
massive difference for me because it meant that my resources that I was producing. So my first part of my career that propelled me forward
Yeah.
was that I won the 2015 PES award, which is Times Educational
Yeah.
Supplement
That's
Award.
amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that was because honestly, because of my masters, because those lectures were so grounded in this sort of stuff that I'm telling you about that they made me
Yes.
rethink completely my resources. So typical resource of mine before meeting them would have been a text and a
Yeah.
few questions, right?
Yeah.
After meeting them, okay, now I need to put at least one activity which focuses on spelling, at least one activity which focuses on word order, at least one activity which focuses on mistakes to correct, at least one activity that focus on these function words, these small words, right?
Yeah.
And suddenly I had a sheet that instead of being just a typical traditional text questions, find the French for these words, I had 8, 10 activities. One sheet was not enough anymore. And
Yes.
the students was able to recycle, to re-encounter the same words many times over, each from a different angle, so that the brain would pay attention not just to the meaning, but all the other facets of knowing a word. If you're familiar with Polynesian research, if you look at, we put that in my book, Breaking the Sound Barrier, I think,
Yeah.
and there are at least 20 different, more dimensions to knowing a word.
Absolutely.
And if you just learn that a word cat or beautiful equals beau in French, you can't use the word beau because it
Yes.
changes before the noun, it changes gender, it changes
Bell.
pronunciation.
Yes.
It's so you can see where a lot of traditional language learning doesn't really match what we know about the brain. That is
So true.
possibly one
So
thing.
true. And we're moving towards the end, and I could spend hours talking to you, Gianfranco. And
Thank
I
you, Andre.
yeah, it's always, interesting to look at the science, look at the evidence, especially coming from cognitive science. And one last question, and then I will ask you to tell
Sure,
listeners about your work, where to find your work. I know you have many things
sure,
online that people can go to, but the
sure,
I think the last question here concerns the communicative approach and translation. And because here's the thing, so you talked about the importance of input and being immersed, let's say, in this environment and actually receiving a lot of the language, the target language that you are learning, but also, considering cognitive overload and considering that students might feel overwhelmed and frustrated. Is there a place for translation, for using the students' first language to help them? Because some teachers believe
absolutely,
that
absolutely.
that is a bad thing. Some very traditional teachers still believe, no, you cannot fall back on L1, right? So what's your take on that?
I like the fact that now people are coming out with translanguaging, right? Because they
Yes.
are,
Yeah.
which is basically, let's face it, it's translation. But they can't
Exactly.
say that because for 30, 40 years they said you can't do it. So now they call it something else. If you have students who speak the same language, it would be very stupid at the early stages not to draw on it because it's a crutch.
Yes.
As long as the students are doing a task in the target language, so the target language is always there. It doesn't matter if they are using the English language as a crutch or simply to reinforce meaning correspondence between two words. Why I tell you that? Because cognitive science, again, tell us something very obvious and intuitive, but which a lot of people, especially in America, they just don't want to accept, which is
Yeah.
a bit weird to me, which is that at the beginning of developing two language systems, so the second language system, and the first language system are so inextricably linked in the brain. The words are stored together. The systems are
Yeah.
overlapping. What does that mean? That every single time a child actually hears the French word, they will automatically activate the L1 equivalent.
Uh-huh.
So whether you say it in the class loud or not, the brain is still translating. So
Yeah.
I understand the ideological stance, which is you need to make sure that the classroom is a simulation of the L2 environment. I can kind of accept it.
Yeah.
But if I have to leave even one child behind because I need to talk constantly in the target language, I think that is stupid. Translation is a form of retrieval practice, so it's good. And let's face it, at the end of the day, cognitive science has also demonstrated that when you show a child a picture, which is the other way not to use the first language, right?
Yeah.
Automatically, the brain translates it into the English word. So you think you're not activating the English language when you show the flashcards? No, you still are. Because at the
Yes.
beginning of the development of the L2 system, the brain, the two systems overlap. Gradually, you can see that as you become more advanced, you don't. You can even dream in English. You can even um, make the mistakes that a native speaker does. For instance, in French, I now make mistakes that a native speaker makes.
Yeah.
For instance, I might subconsciously write E with the acute accent
Yeah.
as ER, like travailler.
Yeah.
And I do it. Whereas before, I would have never made that mistake.
Yeah.
Why? Because now I'm relying on different pathways to before. And that is something that is a bit of a hypocrisy from some people,
Yeah.
partly because they want to sell their method, partly because, let's face it, why was translation called something to be avoided? Because the agenda was that you were supposed to teach English around the world, and backpackers would go all over the world, China, Japan, India, Italy, whatever, to teach languages, and they had to create a method which would suit these monolingual English people, or British or American people, Australian people going around the world
Yeah.
teaching mixed classes or classes where the language would be completely unknown, like Korean, Chinese, and Japanese, right? So it kind of suited that commercial purpose because it was a commercial thing. There was a lot of money to be made, right? So
Oh
the
yeah.
community language teaching approach is also kind of served this commercial agenda. So no, you don't speak the language. So it's okay for an English person with zero knowledge of Chinese to teach Mandarin in China, whereas people like yourselves are trying to learn Mandarin because they want to go there, understanding what the barriers are. So a friend of mine who manages one of the most successful schools in the town where I am now, Lord Byron College, he always looks for native speakers of English, but he prefers, of course, people who have a good knowledge of Italian. Because if the kids said in the class, "Sir, what does that mean?" they can say it means casa, rather than having to use paraphrasing, circumlocution like my teachers used to do, and wasting 15 minutes of the lesson to try and understand what the hell it was. I'll give you an example, and because I don't want to take too much time. I was trained in a Hull University by a person who was a very passionate coach, a language tutor, but in my view, had no idea of science of applied linguistics. And I remember 1 hour of a lesson when she came to observe me to explain the instruction of a simple activity because I was not allowed to use English. And I had to create 30 flashcards to explain that. I lost 10 kids in that classroom who couldn't understand what was going on. I wasted 3 hours planning that lesson, whereas I could have simply said, guys, step 1, step 2, step 3, now you go and speak French for an hour, you know?
Yes.
And they would have spoken French for an hour, but no, because I was not supposed to use the common language of the students, I would have failed the observation. So
I'm so glad,
in America, you find people like this.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you addressed this, Gianfranco, because this is so important. There's this affective connection that you have with your first language that allows you also to make connections with people and understand. I think there was a saying in Italian, and correct me if I'm wrong, se quando ti incazzi non ti esce il dialetto, non sei incazzato veramente, or something like that, right? So I think there's...
Beautiful.
Yeah, I learned that from a teacher a couple of months ago. And there's this connection,
and
really.
it's,
Yeah.
It's the same with praise.
Yeah.
When people keep saying fantastique, fantastique, the kids understands, but when you look them in the eyes and you go, mate, that was absolutely legendary. Come on, tell me, is it fantastique or a gaze in the eye straight saying, dude, you are a legend? Of course, the kids are going to say, wow, Mr. Conti loves me, whereas fantastique is like, oh, yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful.
That was good.
Wonderful, Gianfranco. So now let me ask you, where can people find your work? I know you have a very interesting, very active blog. I think it's gianfrancoconti.com, right? But you have books, you have a language gym. So can you tell us a little bit about your work and where people can find you? Yeah.
Sure. To be honest, the intention was not to come here and it was very nice of you to do this, but just for the viewers, it was not intentional to promote my work. Andre just kindly did it now, and so that was not the intention. But thank you for giving me this opportunity. So basically, we are trying as a language team to promote an approach which is much more brain friendly, but also enshrined in the book called Breaking the Sound Barrier, where we really talk a lot about listening, how to transform listening into speaking in a way which is not contrived, which is brain friendly. And I basically created an approach called EPI, extensive processing instruction. I don't want to talk about that, I don't want to bore you, but you'll find this in this book, Breaking the Sound Barrier. Talking about cognitive science, we have created a book called Memory, where you can find everything that you want to know about memory up to 2020. So all the cutting edge stuff that I've been talking about right now. If you want to find out, instead, you want to have a sort of a more 360 degrees view of language acquisition as in ISLA, Instructed Second Language Acquisition. You find the Language Teacher Toolkit as a brilliant review of all the very, very, very well done. The lead was taken by my co-author, Steve Smith. I have a secondary role, so it's mostly a compliment to him rather than to myself, whereas I took it. Then there's a blog where you can find all of these things that I mentioned completely free. You don't have to subscribe. I hate this thing that you have to go on certain blogs and you need to click subscribe. No, you just go and take whatever you want. It's there. We also created a series of books for French, Spanish, and many other languages, which have a very important peculiarity. If you are a teacher, you can just buy one book and photocopy them freely because we waived copyright. So just buy one copy. It says in the book, fully photocopyable, so we can actually, quote unquote, screw the big publishers who are ripping you off. And so you can simply photocopy it. We don't care. We're not in it for the money. If you teach languages, there's the Language Gym website and the sister website, centersbuilder.com. So languagegym.com and centersbuilder.com, where we basically have created resources to support language learning in the classroom. So they're not Duolingo to learn by yourself. Big caveat, this is for the classroom.
Yes.
And it's aligned with the British Australian curriculum. Having said that, we have a lot of American subscribers too. And it's based on the science that I just mentioned to Andre, for instance, delayed dictation, sentence puzzles, lots of retrieval practice. So you find old school drills as well as more to please the old school people like myself, and then more cognitive, brain-friendly stuff.
Wonderful.
If you are kind of not too judgy, you can you can also watch my videos on the Language Gym channel. Why do I say fair not to judge it? Because they were done during COVID, simply sitting on the couch with zero gimmick. So they're not the most beautiful videos, but you can get a lot of the stuff that I mentioned to Andre. There's about 14, 15 videos I talk about various, and it's completely free to access. That's it.
Okay, that's wonderful, Gianfranco. Thank you again for accepting my invitation. It's been a pleasure. I'm sure this episode will benefit a lot of teachers.
It was a pleasure.
Yes, wonderful. So, folks, you can stay tuned for more episodes of the Learning Cosmos podcast. So, thank you again, and see you soon. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Andre. It was a mega pleasure to meet you. Take care.